Midnight. An empty road outside Pine Ridge. Cameron Hayes was behind the wheel heading home when the screaming cut through the darkness, sharp, desperate, the kind that doesn't wait. Through the smoke and shattered glass, he saw her, a young woman in a white wedding dress, wrist locked to the car frame with an industrial chain. Flames crawling closer with every second. She looked straight at him, not begging, not crying, just barely holding together what was left of her voice. "They said I'd never run again." He had no idea what he was walking into. Cameron Hayes had spent 15 years building something that didn't belong to him alone. Hayes' construction started with his grandfather's single hammer, and a pickup truck during the Great Depression grew through his father's hands into commercial development and landed in Cameron's lap as a company with international contracts and a 20-story headquarters in downtown Pine Ridge. He'd taken it further than either of them had imagined. 16-hour days, closed deals that made industry headlines, a reputation built on precision and follow-through. That was the life he knew how to run. What he didn't know how to run was everything else. His daughter Ruby was 7 years old and growing fast, and most nights he came home after she was already asleep. He'd promised himself things would change after the Tokyo contracts were signed. He'd been promising that for 3 years, ever since Anne died, and left him with a child who needed a father, present, not just a father who paid the bills and showed up on weekends when the schedule allowed. Tonight was supposed to be different. He was going to be home before midnight. He was 12 minutes from the house when the screaming started. The smell hit him first. Burning rubber-hot metal before his headlights caught the smoke, threading through the oak trees along the roadside. Cameron pulled the Mercedes to a hard stop and stepped out without thinking. The wreckage sat 20 yards ahead. A black sedan twisted off the road, hood peeled back, flames spreading from the engine toward the rear of the car. The heat warped the air in front of him as he moved closer. Through the cracked rear window, he saw her. A young woman in a white wedding dress, ivory silk streaked with ash, sitting rigid in the back seat. Her right wrist was locked to the seat frame with an industrial chain, thick steel links, the kind built to hold something far heavier than a person. She wasn't unconscious. She was watching him, eyes wide, the way someone looks when they've been waiting for something terrible and can't tell yet if what just arrived is better or worse. Cameron grabbed the tire iron from his trunk and got to work. The chain was built well. It didn't want to move. He struck it 7 times, each impact sending sparks into the dark sweat running down his face from the heat closing in around them. On the 7th strike, the chain snapped clean. He hauled her out through the door just as the fuel tank went. The blast threw them both forward onto the ground, and Cameron's body moved without instruction. He turned, covered her, took the debris across his back, while the fire finished what had started behind them. When the ringing in his ears faded, he found her trembling against him. The wedding dress was destroyed. She was alive. He checked her pulse. Steady. Her ankle was raw, where the shackle had cut into the skin, bleeding through torn silk. He looked at her face, and she looked back at him. Not with relief, not with gratitude, but with the careful attention of someone still calculating how much danger she was in. "We need to get you to a hospital," he said. Her head moved side to side, immediate and firm. "No hospitals. No police." Her voice was low and controlled, despite everything her body had just been through. "Please, you don't understand what you're asking." Cameron studied her for a moment. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't confused. She was afraid in a very specific way, the kind that came from knowing exactly what the consequences looked like. "What's your name?" he asked. "Belle," she said. Then her eyes moved to the tree line, scanning the shadows the way someone does when they know the threat is still out there. "They might come back for me." His phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. The babysitter checking in the way she did every night he worked late. Cameron declined the call without looking away from Belle. The fire behind them was burning lower now, the wreckage settling into itself. No other cars on the road, no lights in either direction. He could call 911. He should call 911. There was a woman with shackle wounds on her ankle sitting on the side of a Pennsylvania road in a burned wedding dress, and the right thing, the obvious thing, was to hand this off to people with authority and training and the ability to actually help her. That was the rational move. That was the move that kept his life exactly where it was. But Belle was watching the tree line again, and something in the way she held herself rigid, braced like she was already expecting the next blow, reminded him of Ruby after Anne's funeral. That same stillness, that same helpless kind of fear that had no good place to go. "My house," he heard himself say. The words surprised him as much as they surprised her. "Just until we figure out what's happening, and you're somewhere safe." Belle turned and looked at him directly for the first time. Her expression wasn't grateful. It was searching, looking for the angle, the cost, the thing he wanted in return. "You don't know what you're getting into," she said. "Probably not," Cameron said. "But you're bleeding, and you won't go to a hospital. So let's start with getting off this road." He helped her to the Mercedes. She favored her left leg flinched when her arm brushed the doorframe. The wedding dress caught on the handle as she lowered herself into the passenger seat, hand-sewn beadwork catching the dashboard light-quality stitching that didn't come from any ordinary ceremony. This wasn't a small-town wedding gone sideways. Whoever this woman was, she came from money and tradition, and something that had gone very wrong inside of it. He drove her to Pine Ridge General first, not the emergency entrance, the urgent care side where things moved quieter. Belle let the nurse clean and wrap her ankle without protest, kept her eyes down when forms were placed in front of her, gave a name Cameron suspected wasn't real. He stood in the hallway and said nothing. When the nurse stepped out to retrieve supplies, Belle looked at him from the examination table and said, "Thank you." It was the first time she'd said it without something else attached. He nodded and looked at the floor. They drove through Pine Ridge's empty streets in near silence afterward. Belle sat rigid in the passenger seat, hands folded in her lap, head turning at every passing car, every movement in the dark. Cameron kept his eyes on the road and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say yet. His phone buzzed again. This time he answered. It was Jessica, his office assistant, and her voice carried something he hadn't heard from her before, a careful low-grade fear pressed underneath her professional tone. She told him there were men at the office asking about his whereabouts, that they were not taking no for an answer. The line went dead before he could respond. Cameron set the phone down on the center console. His hand stayed steady on the wheel, but his mind was already running the math, how fast that had happened, how direct the connection was between this woman in his passenger seat and men showing up at his office an hour after he pulled her from a burning car. Belle had noticed the shift in him. "What is it?" she asked quietly. "Nothing I can't handle," he said, which wasn't the same as saying it was fine. The house came into view at the end of the block, porch, light on windows dark. He always left that light on for Ruby. He pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment, engine still running, looking at the front door. 15 years of building something careful and controlled, and in the span of 40 minutes, he had made a decision that he already knew was going to cost him. He just didn't know how much yet. He turned off the engine and got out of the car. The first week passed, the way quiet things do, not peacefully but carefully. Belle moved through the house like someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. She helped Ruby with homework at the kitchen table, answered questions about cookies and colors and whether clouds had feelings, and somewhere in between all of it, she started to look just slightly like a person who had stopped waiting for the next bad thing. Cameron noticed. He told himself he was just relieved she was recovering. He also noticed that he was leaving the office earlier each day, 30 minutes one day, an hour the next. The house felt different with Belle in it. Not fixed, not whole, but occupied in a way it hadn't been since Anne died. Ruby had stopped eating dinner in front of the television. She set the table now, 3 places without being asked. Then the messages started. A text came from an unknown number 6 words in a photograph. Beautiful daughter. Would hate for something to happen. Below the words was a picture of Ruby walking out of Pine Ridge Elementary backpack on ponytail, catching the afternoon light. Cameron's chest went cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Someone had been close enough to take that photo, close enough to follow his daughter, and had done it cleanly enough that neither Ruby nor her teacher had noticed a thing. 2 days later, Richard Blackwood walked into Hayes Construction like he owned the building. Expensive suit, silver hair, the kind of stillness that came from never having been told no in a very long time. He settled into the chair across from Cameron's desk without waiting to be invited. His hands were relaxed on the armrests. His eyes were not. "I believe you have something that belongs to me," Blackwood said. "My daughter, Isabella, though I understand she's been going by Belle." Cameron kept his face neutral and said he didn't know what the man was talking about. Blackwood smiled, sharp and patient, the smile of someone who expected exactly that answer. He talked about Hayes Construction with the kind of familiarity that meant he'd done his research, 3 generations, international contracts, a reputation built on relationships and trust. He said it would be unfortunate if circumstances forced a company like that to scale back. He said the construction industry was volatile. He said one dissatisfied client could erase years of work overnight. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and told Cameron he had 24 hours. After Blackwood left, Cameron sat alone in his office for a long time. On his desk was a framed photo, him, Anne, and baby Ruby at the beach the summer before Anne got sick. Ruby was laughing at something off camera. Anne had her hand over her eyes against the sun. He looked at it and thought about what he'd already put them both into without fully understanding the weight of it. That night, after Ruby was asleep, Cameron found Belle in the kitchen. She was sitting at the table with a mug of tea gone cold, hands wrapped around it like she was holding on to something that had already left. He set his phone on the table in front of her and showed her the text with Ruby's photo. Belle looked at it for a long moment, then set it face down without a word. "He found you," Cameron said. "He always does," Belle said. Cameron pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "I need you to tell me everything, not pieces of it. All of it." His voice was quiet, but there was no flexibility in it. Belle looked at the table, then at him, then at the dark window above the sink. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady in the way that things are steady when they've already broken and been held together long enough to harden. She told him her full name was Isabella Blackwood, that her father controlled judges, police chiefs, and enough elected officials across 17 states that going to local law enforcement had never been a real option. That the man she'd been chained in that car to avoid marrying, Douglas Whitmore, was her father's business partner, and the marriage was an arrangement that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with consolidating assets. She told him about the shackle, that Douglas had put it on her himself the night before the wedding and called it preparation. That he wanted her to understand before the ceremony exactly what kind of life she was walking into. Then she told him about her mother. That her mother had tried to leave once years ago and had been found dead in a hotel room 3 days later. The official report said, suicide. Belle said it wasn't. Her voice didn't waver when she said it. That was the part that hit Cameron hardest. Not the words, but the flatness behind them, the way she delivered it, like a fact she had already finished grieving. Cameron's phone rang. Unknown number. Belle looked at it and said to answer it to put it on speaker. He did. Richard Blackwood's voice filled the kitchen like something that had been pumped in through the walls. Calm, precise, and utterly certain of itself. He named a location Riverside Park, the one with the old gazebo near the water, a place Cameron had taken Ruby to feed ducks on Sunday mornings, and told Cameron to bring Isabella there the following evening at 6 o'clock. alone. He said if that didn't happen, social services would receive a detailed report about Cameron's fitness as a parent. He said investigations like that could be very thorough. Then he hung up. Belle pushed back from the table and stood. Her voice was flat and final. I have to go back to him. I can't let him use Ruby against you. Cameron reached across the table and put his hand over hers. No, he said. We're not doing it that way. Belle looked at him like he'd said something in a language she didn't speak. She asked him why. Why would he risk everything for someone he had known for less than 2 weeks? Cameron thought about what it had felt like to see that photo of Ruby. He thought about Anne. He said, because someone has to, and because I can't picture this house without you in it anymore. It wasn't a speech. It was just what was left when he stopped editing himself. Belle looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, Okay, what do we do? The next morning, Cameron drove to Pine Ridge Police Station with Belle in the passenger seat. Detective Sarah Collins met them in a small conference room with a notepad and a look that said she had heard difficult stories before and would need more than a difficult story. She listened without interrupting while Cameron laid out what had happened. The car, the chain, Blackwood's visit to the office, the photo of Ruby, the phone call, with the location and the ultimatum. When he finished, Collins looked at her notepad and said that, without evidence, what he was describing sounded like a family dispute and a real estate negotiation. She said those rarely required federal intervention. Cameron started to respond, but Belle spoke first. She leaned forward in her chair, and her voice had none of the exhaustion it carried in the kitchen the night before. It was clear and direct and had weight behind it. She told Collins that her father operated criminal enterprises across 17 states, that he moved money through construction subsidiaries into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, always in amounts designed to stay below federal reporting thresholds, that he had paid sitting judges to dismiss cases, transferred cash to a sitting U.S. senator, and ordered the death of at least one person who had tried to expose him, her mother. Collins's expression shifted. The notepad got more attention. Collins asked how Belle had access to this information. Belle said she had worked in her father's office during college summers. He had thought it was harmless, his daughter learning the family business, sitting in on meetings, handling files. He had never considered that she was paying attention to the wrong things. For 2 years, she had been documenting everything she saw: names, dates, bank account, numbers, recorded phone conversations, captured on a device no larger than a pen. All of it was stored in a safety deposit box in Philadelphia, registered under a name her father had never heard and couldn't trace. Collins set her pen down. She picked up her phone and said she was calling the FBI. Within 2 hours, they were sitting in a larger conference room with Agent Rebecca Martinez, who specialized in organized crime, and looked at Belle's preliminary documents the way a surgeon looks at an X-ray, focused, precise, and already 3 steps ahead. Belle laid the records across the table and walked Martinez through them. Money flows, shell companies, account numbers, the names of officials on Blackwood's payroll. Martinez asked sharp questions. Belle answered everyone without hesitation. The plan took shape across that table. Belle would go to the meeting at Riverside Park the following evening. She would wear a wire. The goal was to get Blackwood talking, get him on record, confirming what he had done and what he intended to do. Martinez said it was dangerous. Belle said it was the only approach that would work because her father wouldn't incriminate himself in front of anyone he didn't trust completely, and the only person he still believed he controlled was his daughter. The park was quiet at 6 in the evening, the kind of quiet that felt arranged rather than natural. Cameron positioned himself in the shadows near the tree line, far enough back to stay out of sight, close enough that he could see the gazebo and the path leading to it. Belle walked in alone, wearing a simple black dress, the wire taped flat against her ribs beneath the fabric. From a distance, she looked composed. Cameron knew what that composure was costing her. Richard Blackwood arrived exactly on time, stepping out of a black sedan with 2 men flanking him, both in dark suits, both built for the kind of work that didn't get discussed. Blackwood dismissed them with a gesture and walked toward his daughter alone. He looked at her the way someone looks at a problem they're confident they've already solved. "You look well," he said. "Better than I expected after your little adventure." Belle said hello and kept her hands still at her sides. Blackwood moved through the pleasantries with the ease of a man who found them useful rather than meaningful. He talked about the wedding, about Douglas, about the responsibilities that came with the Blackwood name. Belle let him talk. Then she asked about her mother. The park went still. Blackwood's composure didn't crack so much as compress, tightening around the edges while the center held. He said her mother had been unstable, that she couldn't handle the life. Belle said the hotel room wasn't a suicide, and they both knew it. Blackwood looked at her for a long moment, then said she was smarter than he'd given her credit for, and that was the problem. He told her that the evidence she thought she had would never see a courtroom, that he owned too many of the people who ran them. Then he signaled to his men. Both of them moved toward Belle from opposite sides, steady and unhurried. Belle stood her ground, but there was nowhere to go. The gazebo at her back, two men closing in from the front, her father standing between her and the exit, like he'd already decided how this ended. Cameron's hand tightened around the phone in his pocket. The wire was live. Martinez's team was in position. But from where Cameron stood, all he could see was Belle, alone, unarmed, 10 feet from the man who had killed her mother, and the plan suddenly felt very thin against the reality of what was standing in front of her. Blackwood's two men were within 4 steps of Belle when she spoke again. Her voice came out steady and loud enough to carry not panicked, not pleading, but deliberate. She told her father she had recordings of his call to Judge Franklin the previous March, that she had photographs of cash being transferred to Senator Williams in a parking garage off Route 9, that she had 14 months of bank records showing money moving from Blackwood Industries into Cayman Island accounts in amounts carefully kept just below federal reporting thresholds. She recited it the way someone reads from a prepared list, because that's exactly what it was. Blackwood held up a hand, and his men stopped. He looked at his daughter with something that hadn't been in his face before. Not anger, not calculation, but a specific kind of attention that meant he was revising what he thought he knew. "You've been busy," he said. His voice was still controlled, but the ease had gone out of it. Belle said she had spent 2 years being the good daughter, while he planned to sell her like a line item on a balance sheet. She said she had documented everything she could reach, and everything she couldn't reach, she had found other ways to access. Blackwood took 1 step toward her. His voice dropped to something quieter and more dangerous than anything he'd said before. He told her that evidence meant nothing without a courtroom that would hear it, and that he had spent 30 years ensuring those courtrooms belonged to him. He said she was a naive girl who had mistaken preparation for power. Then he signaled his men again, and both of them moved forward. The lights came on all at once. 3 vehicles pulled into the park from separate entrances, headlights cutting across the grass, red and blue strobing through the tree line. Agent Martinez's voice came through a loudspeaker from the lead vehicle, clear and flat, and carrying the particular authority of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. She announced that Richard Blackwood was under arrest on federal charges, conspiracy, money laundering, and accessory to murder. She announced that Isabella Blackwood was under federal protection. She told everyone present to stay where they were. Blackwood's men stopped. One of them looked at the other. Neither of them moved toward Belle again. Blackwood himself stood in the middle of the park path and looked around at the vehicles closing in. And for the first time since Cameron had seen him walk into Hayes Construction 2 days earlier, the man looked like someone who had miscalculated. FBI agents moved in from 3 directions. Blackwood was cuffed with the kind of efficiency that came from having done this many times before. No drama, no resistance, just the mechanical reality of an ending he hadn't written. Cameron came out of the tree line and walked toward Belle. She was still standing in the same spot, hands at her sides, watching her father being walked toward a federal vehicle. Her face was unreadable, not relief, not satisfaction, something quieter and more complicated than either of those things. Cameron stopped beside her and didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say. After a moment, Belle turned away from the vehicles and looked at the dark water beyond the gazebo. "It's done," she said mostly to herself. It was done. But the damage Blackwood had already set in motion didn't stop because he was in handcuffs. In the weeks that followed, 3 of Hayes Construction's largest contracts were quietly canceled. 2 longtime clients stopped returning calls. A profile piece in a regional business publication raised questions about Cameron's judgment, unnamed sources, carefully worded nothing provably false. Blackwood's reach didn't disappear with Blackwood. It just became leaderless, which in some ways made it harder to fight, because there was no single point to push back against. Cameron kept the lights on. He made payroll. He showed up every day and did the work, and he told himself that what had been built before could be built again differently. 14 months later, Hayes Construction occupied a smaller office on the 4th floor of a building it no longer owned. The 20-story headquarters downtown had been sold to cover costs during the worst of it. The new space had better light and worse coffee, and a staff that had been reduced by a third, most of whom had stayed, not because the money was good, but because they believed in what the company was becoming. Cameron had spent the previous year taking on projects he'd have considered too small, before a community center on the east side, a block of affordable housing near the old rail yard, a renovation of a youth facility that had been condemned for 6 years and simply needed someone willing to take it on. The largest project was the women's shelter on Callaway Street. Belle had designed it herself, working with an architect she found through the FBI Victim Services Network, spending 4 months on plans that prioritized natural light and private entrances, and gardens that residents could actually use. She had been specific about every detail in a way that Cameron recognized from watching her in the kitchen. That first week, the same quiet precision applied now to something she had chosen entirely on her own terms. Above the front entrance, a small bronze plaque read, "The Anne Hayes Memorial Center." Belle had insisted on the name. She said Anne deserved to be remembered in something that would last. Ruby was 8 now, and getting more like her mother every month, the same directness, the same green eyes that seemed to process information faster than most adults Cameron knew. She had started calling Belle by name sometime around month 3 naturally, and without ceremony, the way children incorporate new facts when they decide they're worth keeping. She had also somewhere along the way stopped setting 2 places at the table and started setting 3 without being reminded. One evening, Cameron came home to find Belle in the backyard, sitting on the back steps with a glass of water and her sketchbook open in her lap. The light was going down through the trees, the way it did in late summer, everything going gold and soft. Ruby was inside finishing homework. The yard was quiet. Cameron sat down beside Belle, and they shared a silence that had nothing uncomfortable in it, the kind that 2 people arrive at only after they've already said the hard things and survived them. "Any regrets?" he asked. Belle considered the question for a moment before answering, which was the way she always handled questions that deserved a real answer. She said, "No, not about her father, not about testifying, not about any of it." Cameron asked about them, about the house, the life they'd built from what was left after everything went sideways. Belle closed her sketchbook and looked at him. She asked if he had regrets. He said, "Never. Not once." She asked if that included losing the company he'd spent his whole life building. Cameron thought about the shelter on Callaway Street, about the affordable housing going up near the rail yard, about the look on Ruby's face when Belle taught her how to read architectural plans at the kitchen table. "I didn't lose it," he said. "I found out what it was for." Belle stood and went inside. She came back a few minutes later with a small velvet box, and her hands were not entirely steady when she held it out to him. She opened it without preamble. Inside was a simple gold band with a small diamond, worn smooth in places from years of wear, clearly old, clearly loved. She told him it had been her mother's, that her father had kept it in the house after her mother died, stored in a drawer with old documents. He never looked at one of the few things he considered too minor to control. Belle had taken it the night she escaped, slipping it into the lining of her dress, while Douglas was distracted with the photographer. She said her mother had worn it during the years when she was still happy, before everything in her life had been decided for her by someone else. Belle looked at Cameron and asked him to marry her. She said she wanted Ruby to see that sometimes love actually won. Cameron took the ring from the box with hands that weren't quite steady either. He slid it onto her finger, and it fit without adjustment, as if it had been sized for exactly this moment. He said yes, not as a performance, not with a speech, just the word clean and complete. 6 months later, Cameron stood at the front of Pine Ridge Community Church in a suit he'd bought off the rack 2 days before. The church was full in the way that mattered, not with business associates or industry contacts, but with construction workers who'd stayed through the hard months, neighbors who'd watched Ruby grow up on that street, FBI agents who'd become something closer to friends, and women from the shelter on Calloway Street who had heard about the wedding and asked if they could come. Belle had said yes before Cameron finished the sentence. Ruby walked the aisle ahead of Belle, scattering rose petals with the focused concentration she brought to everything she decided was worth doing correctly. She was wearing a pale yellow dress she had picked out herself, and shoes that were slightly too formal for a child her age, which she had also picked out herself. Belle followed in a simple white dress she had bought from a shop 2 towns over. No alterations, no custom fitting. She looked like herself, which was Cameron thought the best thing anyone could look like on the day they were choosing their life. When it came to the vows, Belle spoke without notes. She told Cameron that he had saved her life the night he pulled her from that car, but that what he had actually given her was something harder to name: the experience of being in a place where no one wanted anything from her except her presence. Cameron's vows were shorter. He told her that she and Ruby were his foundation, and that everything else could be rebuilt as many times as necessary. The reception was in the church basement. The cake was store-bought. The band was the Pine Ridge High School Jazz Ensemble, who played 3 songs they knew well, and 2 they were still learning. Nobody cared. Ruby danced with Belle to a song she'd requested 3 times in advance, both of them laughing at something Cameron couldn't hear from across the room. He stood near the door with a glass of water and watched them, and felt for the first time in a very long time that he was exactly where the rest of his life was supposed to start. Later, when the guests had gone and the chairs were being folded up around them, the 3 of them walked out of the church together into the Pine Ridge night. Ruby skipping ahead, already narrating tomorrow's plans to no one in particular. Belle's hand in Cameron's, the street quiet and ordinary and entirely sufficient. He had spent 15 years building things meant to last. He hadn't known until now what the most important one looked like,